Woe is me, for I'm lost. For I'm an anxious man, and I dwell in the midst of an anxious people. It would not be really hard to imagine a contemporary retelling of the call of the prophet Isaiah in such modern terms. The language of emotional and mental health has become quite ubiquitous in our day. The vocabulary of therapy, concepts like trauma and self-care, anxiety, diagnosis, emotional well-being, toxicity, boundaries, narcissism, triggers, safe spaces, have come to take up a significant place in the everyday language of our world. It's become somewhat commonplace in recent days to hear about the reality of the mental health crisis that looms large over our society. And there's no denying that mental health struggles are on the rise. Categorically, numbers related to depression, anxiety, and other emotional difficulties are increasing at rapid rates. The statistics alone are striking, as it's hard to find a data set that does not show an increase of adverse mental health symptoms or diagnoses, as well as a drastic increase in engagement of mental health services. By the latest federal estimates, about 1 in every 8 adults in the United States currently takes an antidepressant, while 1 out of every 5 has recently received some sort of mental health care. Nearly 1 in 3 U.S. adults report symptoms of anxiety and depression. Suicide rates have skyrocketed since the year 2000. And these trends seem to have a specifically adverse effect on teens and young adults, with some studies showing that depression rates among these age groups have more than doubled from 2011 to 2021. But beyond statistics, I believe that many of us have experienced the saturation of these concepts into our everyday world in profound ways. There's a general sense that many of us have, what my kids would call a vibe, that these concepts, concepts of emotional and mental health are of supreme importance, and that we're encouraged at every turn to protect and cultivate and create the proper conditions to pursue these things. When starting to think about this, however, I think we're immediately faced with 2 glaring problems right on the surface. The first problem has to do with the seeming discrepancy between the influx of engagement of mental health services in our moment and the continued increase in mental health problems. Although there could be various reasons for such a seeming contradiction, namely the contradiction that the problem continues to worsen in spite of increased application of care, we must be at least willing to stop long enough to ask questions of what's really going on. For some, the answer to this question lies in the fact that because the issues of mental and emotional health have become more normalized over the last several decades, more people are now seeking help without stigma. This interpretation would believe that the general trends are to be interpreted in a somewhat positive manner, believing that there's not necessarily more people who suffer from these issues, but rather that more people are willing to admit and seek help for things that have always been there. And although we may readily admit that this is a plausible way to interpret the data, it is at the end of the day impossible to prove in a verifiable manner. And I actually think it lacks a fundamental cohesive power to make meaning of the reality. But beyond that, I think there's actually a second problem that we're faced with immediately, and that's one of definition. Although we all probably experience that there is something in the air related to the concepts of mental and emotional health and their supreme importance in our lives, I believe that many of us don't stop long enough to ask what it is that we're actually talking about. Rather, our culture throws around statements as truisms, statements about the importance of protecting or caring for or working on our emotional and mental health, while oftentimes not providing any concrete definition or explanation or substance as to what we're actually talking about or describing why it actually matters. This at times leaves us, or it at least leaves me, feeling like I'm living in a feedback loop that is taken as a given without being given much substance. Why are we all talking about this? Because it's so important. Oh, why is it so important? Because we're all talking about it. But in the face of the clear growing emphasis on mental and emotional health in our world, and the equally clear crisis of mental and emotional health in our moment, it's important for us as God's people to stop and attempt to assess some of these trends through the Bible and through theological thinking. We should ask real questions and seek out real biblical answers. We need to seek, like so many other things, to understand and know the times that we're living in order that we might know how to live in accordance with God's word and his truth as faithful ambassadors of his kingdom while we're living in this world. This is itself no small task, as Christians seem to be eminently unsure of how to engage and relate to the ideas of emotional and mental health. Often, I find accepting premises outright on the basis of sounding biblical. So we actually have our work cut out for us. I want you to kind of buckle up, especially the first lecture. It's going to be a bit heady, so you're going to have to hang with me, okay? To try and chart a course, we must, like we've done in many of these lectures, do a bit of work to understand the water that we're swimming in our present world. Here is my fundamental thesis as we begin the night. Much, and this word's going to be important, and I'm going to talk about why in just a second, but much of the present emphasis on mental and emotional health in our world is the fruit of ideas that were planted in the soil of the Western world generations ago. Sound familiar? Okay, I hope it does. Let me give a little note on my use of the word much here. One of the difficulties that I've experienced in preparing for this evening is trying to bring clarity among what I see as a real tension at work in the topic. It's my desire to expose and highlight and warn of the dangers of a worldview, a way of seeing the world and viewing the world that is pervasive in our day, while trying not to write off or disparage or throw out the actual need for counsel, and in some cases, significant psychological help. What I'm trying to do tonight is to not over-nuance, which honestly is never going to be my struggle, but I do also not want to under-nuance. So here's my aside to bring some perspective to why I said the word much. I don't think that all of the trends or realities related to the crisis of emotional and mental health have to do with ideas. The reason that I say much is because there are significant psychiatric illnesses and disorders, situations of severe abuse or neglect. There are real experiences of significant trauma, as I hope to talk about some in the second lecture, that will create actual obstacles in our lives as it pertains to psychological or emotional or mental well-being. However, those situations are not the primary thing that we're going to be discussing this evening. But their existence does require that we helpfully define our scope, which is why I say much of what is happening in our world is tied to bad ideas that have been planted, taken root, and are bearing fruit in our cultural moment. Okay, that's the end of my aside. That's my nuance. There we go. So I don't under-nuance. There it is. So to say it somewhat differently, I believe on the whole that the growing crisis in our world has as much to do with the way that we see the world as it does with anything else. I believe that over the last several generations, we've adopted a new way of looking at the world, a new set of lenses, you could say, that is fundamentally therapeutic in its outlook. This way of seeing the world has shaped the way that we view what matters. So now we see what matters is emotional health or self-fulfillment. It shapes how we see the problem with the world. You could say we see outside factors that restrain or hinder or adversely affect my emotional and mental health are the problem. And it makes us see how we should go about solving the problem and obtaining what we see as important: self-care, self-realization, self-actualization. I hope to show that this way of seeing the world is profoundly new and novel. My desire is to present the constellation of beliefs that have gone into this way of seeing the world in order that we can assess these ideas biblically and theologically. Then in the next lecture, I want to lay out a series of propositions that I think can help shape the way that we think about and engage and utilize things like counsel, therapy, and even the broader field of psychology. But before we look at the specific ways that we've come to see the world, I want to remind us of something that I have talked about in several of these lectures, but is eminently important for us to remember when we're talking about the idea of the therapeutic. Namely, we need to remember the concept that I call the progressive lie. This is an idea that we all have, to some extent, taken deep into our bones, and it shapes a lot of how we see and think about and evaluate the world around us. The idea that we have come to believe is that the point that we're now standing at, culturally, intellectually, and scientifically, is the highest point in mankind's development. We have been trained to believe that we are, as people, on a perpetual course of progress, that through our own efforts and mastery over the world, we see this through scientific advancement or technological advancement, that as we progress, we continue to do so from our former ways of ignorance, and you could say even barbarianism, to our higher states of enlightenment and discovery. I believe that nowhere do we hold the belief of the progressive lie more potently than in realms discussing ideas like emotional and mental health, what they are, why they matter, and how we obtain them. This has presented all kinds of intrinsic tensions and problems for Christians who seek to think about these things biblically and theologically, as we're often pressured to believe, whether explicitly pressured or implicitly pressured, that because of the so-called advances in the field of psychology, that we as humans now see reality more clearly than our more primitive forefathers. I think it's simply important for us to name that we all have this belief at some level, and we must be willing to question its axiomatic status if we're going to truly assess the imaginaries, the plausibility structures, and the worldview of our present moment. As I've alluded to several times already, I believe the most adequate way of describing our worldview of our contemporary moment is to describe it as therapeutic. This worldview is characterized by a constellation of fundamental beliefs and is the process of a long history of development within the structures of how we think in the West. I believe it's important for us to both spend some time defining and describing the constellation of beliefs and then looking a little bit at the historical developments that led us to the place where we are experiencing the fruits of this way of seeing and thinking about the world all around us. Although there could be many things that are said about the therapeutic, I believe there are 5 specific points of the constellation that makes up the therapeutic worldview that we have to discuss. So there's 5 assumptions or beliefs that I want to talk about that go into making up this whole worldview. Okay, first, the therapeutic worldview is built on a psychological framework of human identity. So the concept of identity is essentially how we as humans answer the question, who am I? Although that is a simple statement, there are many things that go into our sense of identity. And I say sense because our concept of identity is generally not something that we think about propositionally, but rather something we intuit about ourselves in relation to the world. Identity is a really complex way that we think about what the purpose of life is. What are humans? What are we for? What is the goal of our existence? How do we go about finding and discovering meaning and significance? What is the problem with the world? How is the problem solved? What institutions or relationships or pursuits help us to secure and find meaning in the world? The first fundamental assumption of the therapeutic worldview is that our identity, how we answer these questions, is preeminently psychological at its core. In other words, the therapeutic worldview places the concepts of psychological and emotional well-being as the central concern of how we form our identity. Eminent scholar Philip Rieff sought to identify 4 major frameworks of identity that have existed in the Western world. In his work, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, he identifies categories like the political, or the religious, or the economic, or the psychological as the 4 ways that we've sought to understand who we are in the world. So in a political framework, you would see, or man would understand himself in relation to his engagement and life within the civic polis. For much of Western history, thanks to the prominence and importance of thinkers like Aristotle, a political framework has undergirded much of our sense of identity. One could say that the political framework of identity seeks to understand itself through outward engagement in civic life or community involvement. And to the extent it is related to these outside institutions, relationships, and pursuits, that is when man discovers his sense of himself. In a religious framework, man seeks to find and categorize the sense of self in relation to religious activities. Rieff places the religious man as the fundamental category of self-understanding through most of the Western history, but particularly in the Middle Ages, right? As politics and culture and institutions and social life were all organized around the church, attending Mass, holy days, the liturgical calendar, and even the architectural prominence of cathedrals and churches right at the center of communal life. For economic identity, man looks to define himself in relation to goods and services, what I own, what I procure, what I possess in trade and economic activity. For Rieff, the move to the psychological framework is unique in the history of thinking. Whereas the previous frameworks in the Western world utilized external institutions, practices, pursuits, and communities, the psychological framework moves the identification of the self in predominantly and at times exclusively internal and personal ways. Although the framework may be a little too simplistic, oftentimes any tool we use to explain things it does help us to get at a dynamic shift that marks our contemporary worldview, the first assumption. The first assumption is that there's been a profound turn inward for the conceptualization of the self that has happened in recent history. This means whereas people through most of human history sought to primarily make sense of meaning in the world, who are humans? What are we for? How do we find significance? What's the problem with the world? How do we solve the problem? They sought answers for those outside of themselves. Now we seek to make sense of those things in ourselves from a sense of personal, internal, emotional well-being. This leads to the second marker in seeing to understand the nature of the therapeutic, that it comes to see self-fulfillment, again, of these psychological states, self-fulfillment as the highest goal or the highest good. With the turn inward as the basis of self-identification, there is now an emphasis placed on personal happiness, self-expression, self-realization, emotional, mental well-being as the highest good or goal of human existence. Rather than construing meaning and fulfillment on the basis of conforming to or participating in external norms, be they communal, civic, religious, spiritual, or even economic, as the way by which we derive a full life. This point can be illustrated by attempting to imagine how different generations, even different generations in this room, would answer the question related to what it means to be or find fulfillment. In his wonderful book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Carl Trueman helpfully illustrates this point by talking about the difference in how he and his grandfather would have conceived of the ideas of finding fulfillment in their vocations. For members of our grandparents' generation, the question of whether they were fulfilled by their job, if not met with outright confusion related to the question, would have likely been answered on the basis of the ability of the job to allow them to fulfill external duties to their family and their community. Meaning, I can put food on my table. I can provide a home. I can provide good schooling for my children. Now, when many of us are asked if we find fulfillment in our vocation, we assess how we feel in relation to our jobs. Is this meaningful work? Are we happy in our current situation? What do I feel like when I'm doing well at my job? What do I feel like when I'm doing poorly? At the end of the illustration, Truman makes the following observation. The difference is stark. For my grandfather, job satisfaction was empirical, outwardly directed, and unrelated to his psychological state. For members of mine and subsequent generations, the issue of feeling is central. The third marker of the therapeutic worldview is that because of these things, it becomes highly individualistic. This means that life is viewed through the lens of individual experiences, and that these experiences are evaluated and assessed as the primary way that we make meaning in the world. The outworking of such individualistic thinking leads us to believe things like personal autonomy and self-understanding are essential and primary values for us to secure and protect and cultivate. Furthermore, this individualistic tendency leads us to hold that the personal self, the individual, is the only true or authentic standard for evaluating and assessing our own individual experiences. Since the subjective experience becomes such an important aspect of myself, only myself, is qualified or authorized to truly know, interpret, or understand my own experience. So closely tied to this becomes the fourth element of this worldview, which is it becomes dynamically relativistic. Since the subject, me, is the only true interpreter of experience and the meaning or the truth or the reality thereof, this necessitates a relativization of morality, values, and even truth. This concept creates an essential relationship between what the individual feels or perceives and the concept of reality. This has become encoded in our popular language by speaking of my truth, my reality. Now, the final characteristic of the therapeutic that I want to highlight is the manner in which previously held religious ideas become co-opted and secularized in this worldview. Whereas previous identities were constructed around concepts like sin and fallenness, we now speak of ideas like brokenness and dysfunction. We also see concepts like guilt and shame, which at one point were essential to understanding our plight and helping us name our experience and the problem of the world. These become reframed as harmful barriers to our true well-being and self-esteem. Cast in this light, we can see from this constellation of assumptions behind our worldview that the therapeutic, I want you to catch this, at its essence is a type of religious system that seeks to make sense of who we are, our place in the world, what is the problem, and what we should do about it. In sum, the therapeutic tells us that humans are psychological beings, right? We're thinking, or we're feeling emotional, internal things. It tells us that our end, or the highest good, is to experience a sense of psychological well-being. We see that this sense of well-being can only be truly known, experienced, or evaluated by the individual, and the problem is anything that hinders me from experiencing this well-being psychologically. So one of the fundamental outworkings of this worldview, as we'll see more of here in a moment, is that the problem often gets placed outside of the individual in the form of the restraints or the obligations, restrictions, or societal expectations that hinder and limit my internal self from experiencing its truest form of well-being. Thus, the solution to the problem becomes removing from my life all restraints, obligations, restrictions, or societal expectations that are imposed upon me in order to attain self-fulfillment and internal well-being. So before I briefly look at some of how we got here, I want to make one broad observation for us. And I hope that as we walk through this is either, number one, very self-evident to you, or that you would at least be willing to consider this. I want us to see at this point, in discussing the therapeutic as a worldview, as a way of seeing the world, we are not in the realm of science, meaning things that can be quantified, observed, tested, and evaluated. Rather, we are in the realm of philosophy, or even more so, the realm of theology. We are talking about what is. We're talking about how do we know what we know, and we're talking about what should we do because of this. The reason I say it is really important. I say this because the conversation around emotional and mental health almost exclusively gets cast around the issues of science in our contemporary moment. And I'm not saying that there's not science related to psychology or sociology or those realities. However, I am saying that when we talk about what we are for as humans, how we know if we've obtained it, and what we should do about it, we are not primarily in the realm of science any longer. We are in the realm of philosophy. We're in the realm of theology. Now, to call into question the fundamental worldview of our moment is to not go against the science, no matter how much people tell you it is. So, how did we get here? If what we're watching unfold in front of us, not just the rising numbers of mental health issues, but the ubiquitous, saturation of these concepts and ideas across our world, if these are the fruits of ideas planted in the soil of our world generations ago, what we must try to do is ask the question, what are the seeds that were planted? And in specific ways, what ideas have gone into shaping our present worldview that led us to this point? This matters for two specific reasons. First is that, as I have often said in these lectures, ideas do in fact have consequences. Although it's true that many of us in the room may not know or have read many of the thinkers or theorists or philosophers who introduced these ideas into our cultural waters, the adopting of these ideas, knowingly or unknowingly, shapes how we see and live in the world. And at times, it is essential for us to excavate out the ideas that lie behind how we think about things. But more importantly than ever, is the reality that we don't only look at the fruit and try to deal with it. One of the hardest parts of being a human is that we always want a quick fix. So when we start to see these fruits emerge that we don't like, our tendency is always to look at the fruit and to try to figure out what to do about it. However, it's really important for us to remember that we're looking at the fruits of something. And if we try and get rid of the fruits without planting new seeds, new ways of thinking and seeing and believing, then we will not ever actually deal with the fruit. And this is a particular temptation in relation to the topic at hand, because it involves real pain, real distress, and a real experience that's uncomfortable and difficult. Because of this, we're looking for answers, and the world around us is quite ready to give them to us. So, what went into our present way of seeing and thinking, and you could be more honest, our present way of feeling about the world? In the first of these lectures, I spent quite some time outlining the transition in Western thinking from the classical world to the modern world, one that involved the process of reorienting the location or the locus of reality from outside the individual with the goal of the individual conforming their life to that outside ideal to the internal thinking subject. I called the outworking of this transition the enthronement of the self. I'd encourage you, if you forgot what we talked about there or you haven't engaged it, to go back and listen there for a fuller discussion of the process. However, I do want to highlight a few monumental ideas that catalyzed this movement inward, and then spend our time looking at a couple specific ways that this moved from thinking to feeling. So the first tectonic shift, we looked at this in our first lecture, in Western thinking was an idea that's come to be known as nominalism. This is a set of ideas, was a transition of belief that things or universals didn't exist in themselves, but only existed inside the mind of an individual. So what this means is there's a shift in belief that a universal concept of something, let's say if we were to look at something and say that it was beautiful, is not true in itself because the thing is beautiful or because beauty exists as an objective reality, but rather is simply saying about something that I believe to be true about the reality. The subtle shift in thinking moved the basis of a binding reality in the world from outside objective reality to within the mind of the individual subject. So the second shift that we then looked at was this famous declaration of René Descartes. You've probably heard it, where he says, "I think, therefore I am." What was for him an attempt to provide certainty and stability to his existence, it created what was probably unforeseeable consequences of shifting the location of determining reality inside over the course of several centuries. Now, what these two conceptual shifts did was create a framework or set the table for a set of radical concepts to take hold that would move us further internal in our concept of determining truth, as well as move the faculty of that knowledge from reasoning or thinking to the psychological or feeling self. So the first of these ideas would be given to the world through a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Man is born free, and everywhere he's in chains, is far and away Rousseau's most famous statement on the human condition. This summary statement gives us two specific beliefs that further turn the conceptualization of the self inward. First, we see his belief that man himself is free, meaning that the unhindered and unencumbered, the individual is the basis of true liberation and knowledge. Essentially, Rousseau is specifically and intentionally undermining the biblical concepts of total depravity and the sinful nature of mankind by saying that man, as he is in himself, is not the problem. This leads to the second aspect of the sentence of his belief that has profound implications for our present worldview. Rousseau believed that the problem with man was not himself, but with all of the external obligations and expectations that enslaved him. This meant that every external authority, every tradition, every religion, and every social norm was to be rejected in discovery and liberation of the self. The next major thinker in the inward and subjective turn is psychoanalyst. Did I emphasize psycho? I'm sorry. Freudian slip. Sigmund Freud. Freud introduced concepts into our cultural framework that have more profoundly shaped our contemporary thinking than we may know. He proposed that human identity was located in really deep recesses of the unconscious mind and in childhood experiences of desire and repression. Because of this, people are plagued throughout their life with deep internal conflicts within their psyche, and they must explore and excavate these repressed unconscious desires and motives. Now, although Freud's framework and his methods have often been abandoned by future psychologists, particularly Americans, because Freud's way too pessimistic for us. We're an optimistic people. We can't be pessimistic like Freud is. Although a lot has been rejected of his framework and his methods, it is not too much to say, I don't believe, that we are living in a Freudian world. I told somebody the other day, I was like, this is Freud's world, we're just living in it. His theories have transformed the way that people understand and assess identity. They undergird the widespread contemporary belief that well-being is dependent on unearthing and integrating our unconscious desires, specifically as it relates to liberating these desires from repression and societal expectations that have adversely affected our truest selves. When we are told that we need time to explore our anxiety or fear or shame, when we're told we need time to work out our issues, or even shorthand, we need time to do our work, we must understand that these are popularized conceptions of the Freudian understanding of the self writ large in our contemporary world. Now, the final thinker that I want to reference is likely someone that many of us have never heard of, but who has had, I believe, actually a disproportionate effect on popular American psychology, and unfortunately, its inroads into Christian thinking. Carl Rogers did much to build on Freudian concepts, but augmented them in a manner that became much more palatable, again, here optimistic, for American pop culture. Rogers was a psychologist that practiced for over 3 decades in the mid-1900s and is the father of what's called client-centered psychology. And his seminal work on becoming a person is considered by some, particularly among his students, to be the Bible of secular psychology. Now, there are 2 realities that I want to highlight that come from Rogers that I think have finalized the inward turn and cemented the therapeutic as the predominant worldview of our world. The first is Rogers' concept of the interrelatedness of the feelings, the self, and reality. To Rogers, the goal of counseling is to create a context in which the masks that a person has built in response to external obligations and expectations can be put aside in order that the individual can feel his truest feelings. The reason for this, argues Rogers, is that because it is only when an individual feels their true feelings as they are, does a person become who they truly are. I want you to hear his words. These are his words, not mine. He says, when the client fully experiences the feelings which at an organic level he is, then he feels an assurance that he is a part of his real self. Here's again. I have gradually learned that the individual in a moment of true feeling is coming to be what he is. When a person has, through therapy, experienced in this fashion all the emotions that naturally arise in him, as he has experienced them in his knowing and open manner, then he has experienced himself in all the richness that exists within himself. He has become what he is. Do you hear this? It's only when a person feels that they are their real self. In other words, whereas the initial stirrings of the inward turn with Descartes moved the locus of reality inside of the thinking self, now the truest conceptions of the self are the feeling self. If Descartes could posit existence on the basis, I think, therefore I am, you could imagine the new form of existence summarized in the words, I feel, therefore I am. However, Rogers doesn't stop there. Elsewhere, he argues that it's only in relation to an individual's feelings do we come to know reality. Hear his words again. The person reacts to the field as it's experienced and perceived. This perceptual field is, for the individual, reality. I want you to catch this. What Rogers has done and what has become so popularized in light of this type of work is to locate reality within the feeling self. So when we hear phrases like my truth, we are directly living out of the fruit of this kind of thinking. This summarizes the first major concept that he popularizes in his practice, and that has become somewhat axiomatic in our ways of perceiving the world, that we are what we feel, and that is, for us, reality. Now, the second concept that Rogers deposits into the popular imaginary is his description of the conditions in which a person can come into such a state of being, their true self. So for Rogers, a person can only hope to enter such a state of true experience, meaning feeling their feelings as they really are, in a context that is fully accepting, warm, safe, and empathetic. You could add that in this context needs to be completely non-evaluative and non-judgmental. Again, I want you to hear Rogers' words, not mine. As a second condition for personal growth, I find the more acceptance and liking I feel toward this individual, the more I will be creating a relationship which he can use. By acceptance, I mean a warm regard for him as a person of unconditional self-worth, of value, no matter what his condition, his behavior, his feelings. I also find that the relationship is significant to the extent that I feel a continued desire to understand, a sensitive empathy with each of the client's feelings as they seem to him at the moment. It is only as I see those feelings as you see them and accept them and you that you feel really free to explore all the hidden nooks and frightening crannies of your inner and often buried experience. There is also complete freedom from any type of moral or diagnostic evaluation, since all evaluations, I believe, are always threatening. Now let me interpret this for us, because you may have never heard of Carl Rogers in your life, but you live in a world that is marked by this last paragraph. This is the water we swim in. What he is saying is that for someone to truly become themselves, meaning for them to truly feel and to be who they are in reality, as internally experienced or perceived, requires others to enter into your feelings as the same way as you, to see them as you see them, and to accept them fully without any evaluation, which is always threatening. This means that it's not the responsibility of the individual to cultivate the resilience and fortitude and perspective and maturity to navigate the difficulties of life. Rather, it's the responsibility of others to create safe spaces for me to experience the fullness of what I feel to be true, no matter what. This belief has led to our contemporary moment and is pervasive in how people see and relate to the world. This has led to what we see before us everywhere, right? The rise of safe spaces, trigger warnings, even the counsel to sever yourself from loving relationships because they're toxic. The sad reality is that this is the world that we live in, and the fruits are coming to bear. However, we as the people of God must be willing to take an honest look, not just at the fruits, meaning we don't have to just yell about the fruits or try to cut them out, but an honest look at the seeds that have been planted, even in our own ways of thinking and seeing the world. I believe one of the fundamental problems of the therapeutic world is that it does actually hit a chord with things that are real. As humans, we do feel loneliness and anxiety and shame and guilt and depression and fear and sorrow and alienation and a whole slew of other really difficult realities. Yet, what the worldview does is point at an experience and attempts to give a narrative as to why we feel that way. And I just want to say this, the narrative is wrong. It ultimately shortchanges our concepts of who we are as humans. What are we for? What's wrong with the world? And what is the solution? And therefore, what should we do about it? It should be easy for us as the people of God to stand up and provide answers to these questions. However, from what we have seen, this is not very popular. Not only is it not popular, it's also been deemed unloving, abusive, threatening, toxic. And if there's one thing that we don't want to be called as Christians, it's unloving. However, we must be willing to assess reality according to the Word of God, according to the truth that has been revealed to us. We must be willing to stand with whatever God says, no matter the cost and no matter how much we might be called unloving, uncaring, threatening, even abusive or toxic because of it. And this is not because we're simplistic or archaic or disconnected from reality. Or even worse, it's not because we're hateful or judgmental or abusive. Rather, it's because we as God's people believe that God alone gets to define what humans are for. What does it mean to be fulfilled? What is wrong with the world? And what is the glorious solution? And therefore, what should we do and how should we live? And we have to believe that God's ways are good because we believe that God is good. Amen.